In February, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana said government debt would stabilise at 73.6% of GDP in the 2025-2026 fiscal year. Fast forward to June and the IMF has cited the ongoing power outages in the country and weaker commodity prices as well as a less than favourable external environment as key headwinds to the South African economy and its ability to grow materially. It has therefore concluded that the country won't be able to stabilise its public debt over the next few years and says government needs to do more in cutting down on expenditure.
In fiscal policy, the IMF's projections are quite negative. It is worse than Treasury's projections and worse than our projections, partly because the IMF assumes that South Africa's trend growth will be only 1.4%. We agree that if growth only averages 1.4%, that debt stabilisation will be questionable.
But as the South African government is urged to better rein in its spending, economic growth has to also be a factor. With inflation raging, the South African government still has to ensure that it takes care of the country's key priorities.
You need quite decent economic growth to be able to get the tax revenue coming in so that you can sustain the spending that you need to do. But a big part of fiscal consolidation is also control and discipline on expenditure. And while there has been some evidence about better control of the government's wage bill, we need more emphasis on that down the line.
The public wage bill remains a major cause for concern for the IMF and even the ratings agencies. This year, the government agreed to give public sector workers a 7.5% wage increase against its earlier position of a 3.3% rise. It now has to find an additional 37.4 billion rand it had not budgeted for. On the structural reform front, the IMF lauded the country for its efforts, particularly in the energy space.
In many instances, South Africa is well aware of the problems. We have plans, but we haven't implemented them yet. Operation Vulindlela has been very successful and instrumental in driving the reforms that we've seen in areas such as electricity and communication. What is required is that we now roll this out into other areas of growth constraint as well.
While the private sector has spent billions of rand on investing in alternative energy, serious movement still needs to be seen in fixing Transnet's logistical bottlenecks, as its role is critical for the economy.
I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses in terms of future economic growth. The fact that Transnet, as another state-owned enterprise, really has failed us in terms of the ability to get goods to the harbours, to transport the bulk exports. So I'm not hopeful that that will be very soon. It does seem, though, that Transnet has made a head shift from this insistence on private sector contracts only for 5 years. And let's face it, which company in the private sector would have invested billions of rands if it's only a 5-year contract?
On monetary policy, the IMF has urged the SAB to continue with the process of normalising interest rates, which suggests it's supportive of more rate hikes, and has suggested that in the long term, the central bank moves to target a lower inflation bracket than the current 3 to 6%, an idea which the Reserve Bank is already known to have been thinking about. Nompumelelo Siziba, SABC News, Johannesburg.